Ember Witch. Book 1. The Lich. Volume 1. Black Tragedy. Chapter 2. The Nightmare Begins. September 8, 457 to October 17, 458 BME. Fragment 11. Research. Syrya arrived at the chapel holding the box in her hands. The binding spell she had weaved around the box had faded 2 days before she arrived in Meridia, so she had to protect herself the rest of the journey with one around herself. She wouldn't be able to open the box for days if she did another around it, so she had to cast it on herself to keep the dark magic from affecting her. This of course came at the price of being unable to cast magic until it wore off. She walked into the sanctuary, placed the box on the floor at the feet of the 3 statues, and then set the necklace down next to it.
"Father Haith, Brother Jaren,"
she called out, hoping they were close by.
"Ah, my daughter, how was the trip?"
Father Haith said, stepping out of a side room. Syrya had a large frown on her face, a stern look of worry. Father Haith looked towards the box and the necklace on the floor and frowned as well.
"It's as we feared. It's a page of the narcosis. It has magic still etched in it by the ink used to write it. I can't begin to explain the power it has. It gave the poor family nightmares almost every night,"
Syrya exclaimed, slipping into her native Elvish cadence. Her words were understandable, but still a bit hard to make out because of how the Elven pronounced their W's and I's, gravitating to a V sound and a Y sound respectively.
"My daughter, calm down. You are safe under the house of the gods. Take a rest and we will discuss what to do in the morning. Jaren, lock the chapel. No one is to enter until we are certain it is destroyed and cannot affect anyone else."
Father Haith yelled out to the boy sitting in the room he had just come from. Jaren got up and rushed down the hall. Moments later a large banging noise echoed through the hall, followed by the clicking sound of several locks.
"Now my child, let me go over the notes and I will determine how to handle the family who was affected by this blasted thing,"
Father Haith said, reaching his hand out. Syrya pulled the pages she had tucked away from her pocket and placed them in his hand.
"There is another thing, Father. That necklace there. I believe it has an extremely powerful object from the time of the gods attached to it. When I was locking the page away in the box, I got a glimpse of something in my mind. Like a vision, it was Setra, Father. It stood there in a clearing. I saw it clear as day, a large buck with massive antlers just like the statue. I'm not sure what it is, but it has magic emitting from it like a fire,"
Syrya said, looking toward the small green gemstone sitting on the floor.
That's peculiar indeed, my child. Was it in the box with the note?"
Father Haith asked.
"No, it was around the mother's neck. She claimed it was a wedding gift from her husband. I have no clue how it came into possession by the same family that found a page of the narcosis. I am assuming it's why the page had affected the whole family instead of just the girl who initially found the page tucked away in the back of a book," Syrya said.
"I see. Let us pray over this and decide what to do in the morning,"
Father Haith replied calmly after a moment.
"Go get some well-deserved rest, my daughter. The gods will have answers for us in the morning,"
he continued.
"Yes, Father,"
Syrya said. She left the sanctuary and walked to her room. She ripped off her robe and threw it to the floor. Collapsing on her bed, she fell asleep almost immediately. Father Haith looked to the little box sitting on the floor, placed his hands together and looked away, reciting a prayer. He walked to his room and sat on the floor. He meditated in prayer the rest of the night. Farron was restless in his bed. He tossed and turned, although still in a coma. His body began to convulse, he shook as his muscles contracted. He saw a green gemstone hanging from a chain in his dream, then it was washed away as his body calmed. Syrya stepped into the sanctuary the next morning wearing a black robe with the hood drawn over her head. She stood there in anticipation for what was about to happen.
"My children, I have prayed for a solution to our little issue. I believe the right course of action is to burn the page and bury the ashes sealed in an urn underneath this church. I cannot allow for this dark magic to exist in the world after the power it showed to still possess. The family it has affected must be here to witness its destruction and for the gods to purge them of any evil that may still persist in them,"
Father Haith explained, pacing back and forth in front of the locked box sitting on the floor.
What of the gemstone necklace?
Syrya asked.
I'm still unsure about that. If what you said is true, it may be a relic of the gods. It may be worth our time if you study it. Use it as a conduit for your magic. You did say it gave you a vision of Cetra?
Father Haith replied.
Yes, Father, I saw it as clearly as I see you,
Syrya said, looking directly at Haith as he stopped pacing to answer his question.
You will look after it. Study its magical properties and report your findings to me. If it is an instrument of Cetra, the gods must have a plan for us to use it.
Father Haith replied, stroking his chin.
It will be at least 3 weeks before this family arrives. What are we to do with the page until then, Father?
Jaren jumped in the conversation.
We must keep the chapel locked up until then. No one goes in or out. Yes, our services will be sorely missed, but we cannot allow for anyone to be exposed to this magic.
Father Haith said with hesitation.
But we have the only mage healer in the Queen's crown. We surely can't close our doors to those that need our help.
Jaren said, shocked by the news.
No, he is absolutely right, Jaren. This page is too powerful for the people to handle. I can barely stand near the thing without feeling sick, and I am still locked from using magic. I can feel it emanating radiation as we speak.
Syrya said, closing the argument from going further.
We must keep it locked away until it is destroyed. I will keep it in my room until then. You two do not have the ability to resist its influence like I do. I do have a request of you two. Do not take this the wrong way, but you must leave me alone with it for the next few weeks. If what I'm thinking works, I may be able to study both it and the gemstone at the same time. Do not disturb me, I must have full concentration.
Syrya finished.
If you believe this is the right course of action, I will comply with your request.
Father Haith replied.
Thank you, Father. I will give you a report when I learn more about these relics.
Syrya said, bowing her head, placing her hands together.
Jaren, write the family and request their presence. We must have them here within the month.
Father Haith requested his son.
Yes, Father.
Jaren replied and walked away to gather his supplies. Syrya walked to the box and the necklace, picked them up and strode to her room, locking the door behind her. Farron felt a shock of energy from his arm and began twitching. He saw another flash image in his dream. A woman walking into a room and locking the door behind her. It lasted only a second, then vanished. He turned in his bed and began to mumble. Syrya had been sitting on the floor for an hour. Her back was beginning to ache and her hands were trembling. Although she couldn't cast magic, she was glowing black. The gemstone in front of her glowed a brilliant green light.
I knew it. It amplifies magic. It's as if it acts the same as a binding object.
She was speaking out loud to herself, making sure to note everything she was experiencing in her mind for later review in her report. She had pushed herself too far over the last hour, but what she had just learned was worth the pain. She was sweating now, her muscles fighting to move as she stood up. She lay on her bed, trying to fight the aches, pains and shaking, but her efforts were a loss. She teared up and let out a groan as her body gave in.
Gods, this isn't anything like what I thought it would feel like,
she said after regaining some control over her body. She could feel the energy radiating out of the box stronger now that she had exhausted herself. She looked over to the box sitting across the room from her. She wanted to study it, learn all she could about this mysterious page straight out of legend, but she resisted. She couldn't move too fast with such a relic. Trifling with such magic unprepared and exhausted like she was would certainly turn out horribly, not only for her, but the city itself. She could be corrupted and use it to murder or raise chaos. It could kill her leaving the city without a healer or even cause her to lose her mind, rendering her a broken woman. She looked away from the box and stared at the ceiling. Her eyes began to cloud over as her attention moved into complacent, mindless thoughts.
The mother, Eve, she said it would give her nightmares. I must be ready to record anything if I am haunted by such visions,
she thought, and stood up, grabbing her inkwell, quill and papers. She lay back down, then shortly afterwards fell asleep. Eve, Lilith and Ares were sitting in the third-row pews listening to their priest recite a prayer. Their heads were down in solace, arms folded. The priest finished his prayer and the congregation repeated with him. In the Lords of creation we reside. The three of them sat there still in prayer as the congregation left the church, only leaving the priest in the room.
My children, is there something you need?
The short fat man said, walking up to the three women.
Yes, Father, recently our family has been affected by a presence of unholy nature. We were visited by a mage and were told to seek your help and guidance,
Eve said, looking up to the priest. His stubby body shadowing them only slightly in the rays of the afternoon light. His face was grim and he choked up a bit.
What do you mean, Eve?
He asked, shocked by what he had just heard.
My daughter had discovered a mysterious note within a book I gave to her for her birthday a year ago. It had been plaguing us with nightmares and feelings of being watched at night. The mage had been very adamant that we were to seek the Lord's power to rid ourselves of these feelings. I am at a loss of what to do, Father. We can't sleep. We are losing our appetites and beginning to fear the night. I stay awake for hours fearing that I will see these dark visions in my sleep, and my daughter sees similar horrors during the night,
Eve said, beginning to tear up.
Oh Eve, my darling child, this is a dark turn of events. Tell me, is the note still in your home?
The priest asked.
No, the mage took it from us 2 weeks ago, but we are still feeling these terrible things,
Eve said, tears streaming down her face.
We have prayed and attended service, but still we feel this attachment upon us,
she continued.
Come, let us pray together,
The priest said, sitting with the three of them. Ares looked up and stared into his eyes.
I haven't seen anything in my sleep,
Ares said calmly.
Dear Ares, what your mother and sister are seeing in their dreams is something that you should fear. It is an image of evil. Tell me, Lilith, what do you see?
The priest asked, hoping to gauge the situation of all three women.
Just a body laying in a river. It's holding a black knife, but I can't make out any detail of who it is. I've gotten used to it by now. It's my mother I'm worried about,
Lilith answered, looking up at Eve.
Eve, what do you see in your dreams?
He asked after a moment.
It's gotten worse since the mage left. I'm seeing death and gore, bodies being mutilated, and even acts of evil I can't bear repeating,
Eve answered as she began shaking.
Lords of creation, may you take mercy on these women. Purge the evil from their souls and allow them to be bathed in your love. Take away their burdens and return the light back to their life,
The priest said, grabbing the three girls' hands. Eve cried, letting the emotions of her struggle pour out.
I'm afraid that's all we can do for now, my children. We must let the gods do their divine work. Please pray for your family every night,
He said, standing up. He walked over to the podium, pulled out a small bottle and handed it to Eve.
It's blessed water. Place a drop on each of your foreheads before you sleep. It should help fight the nightmares,
He finished.
Thank you, Father. May the Lord's power heal us,
Eve said, wiping her tears away, then grabbed the bottle. They left the church and made the short walk back home. Eve walked in the door and picked up her copy of the Book of the Gods. She flipped the book open and began reading it. Her kids were close behind her. They sat down in the front room and listened intently to the holy words. Syrya was again in pain, sitting on the floor. Her arms were shaking tremendously above the gemstone. The box sitting next to it was open, the page still tucked inside. A black aura glowed around it as she concentrated deeply. The page began to shift and float up into the air. It unfolded and displayed all its cryptic writing. A word began to illuminate on the page and Syrya studied it.
Vy, that's the ancient word for death,
she thought. The page dropped from the air back into the box and she slumped over in pain. Gasping for air, she reached out to her quill and wrote down everything. It had been 3 days since her first study, and she had learned that even bound magic can't reveal the answers she needed. She had been able to get 3 words to illuminate: death, sacrifice, and black. She didn't understand what it meant, but she was certain that it was not good. In her studies at the Salvach Mages Hall, she learned that the dark mages of old would embed instructions to rituals within the pages of the Narcosis. She wasn't sure, but her suspicions were that this page held such instructions, but for what kind of ritual she didn't know. She had to figure it out before the family arrived to ensure that they hadn't been unknowingly preparing this ritual after being exposed to the page for so long. Eve had said it was in their home for a year in her letter, so Syrya wanted to know if they had been learning parts of the ritual in their sleep. Her dreams so far were normal, just fantasies of pleasure and an odd dream about eating spicy soup, but she was certain that she would have a breakthrough. She laid on her back in too much pain to get up on her bed. The pairing of being locked, using bound magic and handling the page were taking a huge toll on her health. She hadn't eaten since she locked herself away and only drank a bit of a citra berry and haven stem potion to keep herself from passing out from lack of nourishment. The intoxicating effects of the haven stem were fun, sure, but its pain relief properties was why she picked it for the mix. She took a swig from the bottle after struggling to pick it up and lift herself up enough not to spill it all over her face. The high kicked in quickly, and she lay there staring at the ceiling, focusing on her experience tonight. She made it so far in such a short time, but she was still far from any real answers. She picked herself up off the ground, then lay on her bed, falling asleep pretty quickly. Eve was sitting in the front room when she heard a knock on the door. She stood up, walked to the door, and opened it.
Good evening, Eve. I have a letter for you. An owl dropped it off to me this morning,
the young girl at the door said, holding out an envelope with a red wax seal.
Thank you, Mary,
Eve said, taking the envelope and looking at the seal. It was stamped with 3 shapes: a snake, a buck, and a wolf. Eve looked surprised and ripped it open in a haste. She unfolded the paper and read it through quickly, then once again, to make sure she had just read what she did.
I hope it's good news, Eve. I've heard that there was a pretty big accident in Meridia recently. I'm not sure of the details, but rumors have it that several people died,
Mary said solemnly.
It's better than good news. It's the best thing I've been told in years,
Eve said excitedly.
Well, I'm glad to hear. I've got a few more letters to hand out, so I best be going now. Have a great day and tell your kids I said hi,
Mary said and walked away. Eve closed the door and ran into her kids' room.
Girls, guess what?
She said with a big smile on her face.
What is it, Mum?
They both said at the same time, then laughed together.
I just got a letter from the church. They want us to come immediately. They said they have found a way to help us,
Eve said, holding her arms out waiting for a hug.
That means we can visit your father,
she continued, grinning with pure joy on her face.
What?
The 2 girls said excitedly.
We get to see Dad?
They asked, then got up and hugged their mother.
Let's pack our things, we will leave in the morning,
Eve said, hugging them back.
Darren Myers, Ordenlock, Stenfest, Hochstellen, and Gerrit Vettel. These men were bold and brave men. They left their families and sacrificed their bodies to build this great city. Their loss will not be in vain. We as a species are strong and resilient. Our city walls will protect us from outside harm for generations to come. Don't let the loss of a few break down our hearts, as their memory will push us forward. We will later rest their souls and pray for their families.
A tall, light-haired man with a long beard was speaking loudly to a crowd of people. Some were crying while others were silently staring at the ground. The accident was tragic. The wall of the city had fallen down, crushing the men working on it with such force that it had left a massive pool of blood and guts splattered against the ground. It was so sudden that none of the men had any time to react, just seeing their lives flash before their eyes, then they were gone. So far, the construction of Meridia had left around 100 injured and at least 60 dead this year alone. It was grim to think that the men working here would die such terrible deaths, but in the line of building a city spanning the entire Queen's Crown Mountains, it was inevitable that many more would die. The mountains were massive, spanning 100 miles or more, and the city itself was started at the seashore 100 miles away from the mountains. The building project was massive, and since the humans were the only race to settle the area in 200 years, they wanted to prove their power and might, not just by the sheer numbers, but by their ability to create the largest city in all of Valsilla. The Orson were desert scavengers, and barely ever made it up as far as the Ashlands. The plains before Temper Mountain were too hot for a proper settlement, and the evergreen forest couldn't be tamed due to its dense fog that turned anyone around after wandering too deeply into it. The only other area the humans could settle besides the Queen's Crown was the flat lands east of the evergreen forest, but it was home to a mysterious race of fox-like people who would hunt any that desecrated the land. They were fierce savages, almost primitive in nature, so the humans decided to settle in the best place they could. Protected from the north, south and west by the Queen's Crown and to the east by the Great Sea. The only soft spot in their defense was to the north just at the end of the mountains, but that was all changing since the city wall now expanded across the plains with large gates guarded by archers and heavily armed soldiers. The destruction of part of this wall was a setback, but it was just an accident after all. One mistaken design that killed several people could be looked over as long as it was rebuilt and the architect axed for his fuck up. The crowd dispersed in a slow manner, still shaken by the tragedy.
I can't believe that the church didn't send a representative. It's almost blasphemous not to,
Gerald said under his breath as he stepped away from the crowd. He was the head of the construction crew that perished, and he even requested that the priest appear himself, but the doors were locked, the lights were out, and no one answered his many knocks. He was confused, angry, and very much depressed at the thought that his men could die and the church didn't care. There were more and more people getting injured and no one to heal their wounds. Yes, there were doctors around, but they had nothing on the church healer. The magic and knowledge of that church was what the city needed, and the church was nowhere to be seen. Gerald walked into his home, shut the door, and cried. Syrya had done it. She finally broke through the code, or at least she thought she did. She had been locked away for a week now, and she had gotten so far in her studies. She learned that this page did contain a ritual and that it was for a form of sacrifice. She had 7 words now. Sacrifice, child, black, moon, lich, blade, and the most intriguing one, Veer. She knew that the book was like a Bible to Veer, but not that Veer had a direct effect over it. The ancient goddess of darkness was one of the gods of creation before she was cast out for creating the mother of venom, Mor. She only knew legends and fairy tales of it, but from the stories she could gather. Mor was a giant spider. She controlled the core of the planet and caused groundquakes, as well as being the mother of the Arachnim. Although not her direct spawn, the Arachnim were transformed due to her magic. Syrya had only the basic knowledge of the Arachnim history due to them not interacting with the other elven much. Syrya was on her last leg at this point. She had been using too much of her life force, with the gemstone as her binding object, that she lost 10 pounds. Her face sagged against her skull, making her look 14 years older, and her skin was pale and wrinkled. She knew she would die if she pushed too far without rest, but she was still a few days away from being unlocked from her magic. It was dangerous for her to continue, so she decided to take the next day and rest. She would exit her room, get some food, and check on the man still in a coma in the next room. Once her magic was unlocked, she wouldn't have to use the gemstone again. She wrote down the little bit of info she had on Veer and Mor, then passed out on the floor. She awoke hours later and got up. She unlocked her door and stepped out, each step causing her pain, so she swiped the bottle of Cetra berry and Haven stem, swigged it, and placed it open in her pocket. It was pretty much empty, so she didn't worry about it spilling. Just before she made it past the room with her still unknown patient, she turned around and walked back to her room, picking up the necklace and wrapping it around her neck. She tucked the gemstone into her cleavage, then made the wobbly track to the kitchen.
I'm worried about her father. It has been a week and she hasn't left her room yet. We must check on her.
Jaren's voice rang out from across the hall as Syrya entered the kitchen.
She must be left alone, Jaren. She is a maid, she knows her limits. When it's time she will emerge, trust in her.
Father Haith replied, trying to convince his son not to interrupt Syrya. She listened to them bicker for a minute, then went back to rummaging through cabinets for food. She found an apple, some strawberries, and a loaf of bread. She cut it into slices, placed one slice on a plate, then began chopping the fruit into small pieces. She stacked the mixed fruit onto the bread, then rummaged some more to find her secret ingredient.
Aha, here it is,
she said, grabbing a bottle of honey.
A little honey with pepper and my creation is done,
she said, shaking the contents onto the fruit. She placed the second slice of bread on top and took a huge bite. Savoring the sweet and spicy flavor, she chewed slowly, letting her mind mull over every bit of her sandwich. She grabbed a cup from the table and dipped it into the bucket of water, then gulped it down with satisfaction. Refilling the cup, she stepped out of the kitchen and sat at the feet of the giant statues.
Lords of creation, bless this food and let it nourish my weary body,
she prayed, then munched down on her sandwich, smiling at its intense flavor and enjoying every second of it. She finished her food, drank down the water with a long drag and walked back to the kitchen to place her plate back and clean up her mess.
She lives,
she heard from behind her. Startled, she turned around, almost striking out in fear. She smirked.
You scared me, Jaren. You know how I can be when I get frightened,
she said with a laugh.
Oh, believe me, I know. I still have a scar from it,
Jaren said, lifting his sleeve to show a small burn mark.
Sorry about that,
Syrya said, looking away.
Don't worry about it, sister. It was my fault. After all, I should have known not to scare a mage,
he said, laughing.
You don't look so good. Are you okay?
He said a moment later.
I'm fine. I just need some rest,
Syrya said, trying to hide her damaged body.
Rest? Oh no. You need more than that. You need to stop. It has been a week. Both father and I are worried about you. I mean, look at you. You look like you've aged 30 years. Whatever it is you think you can learn from that evil thing is not worth it,
he said, trying to be as polite as possible.
I know what I'm doing, Jaren,
she said in a bit of anger.
Okay. I'm just saying that it's not healthy even for a mage to be locked away for so long. We need you, and I don't want to see you destroy yourself over something like this,
he said, trying to defuse the tension building in the room.
I will be fine. I'll give you my report soon and then we can destroy the page and be rid of all of this,
she said, realizing that she had gotten angry.
Your horns have grown a bit. They look good,
he said after a moment.
Is it a side effect of your exposure to the page, or are you just growing?
He asked with a smile. Syrya reached up and noticed that her horns had grown a few inches.
I didn't even notice. I guess I'm growing.
She smiled and began poking her finger against one. She felt a pain in her foot and her buzz was wearing off, so she took the bottle out of her pocket and took another swig, emptying it. She placed the bottle back in her pocket, then stepped around Jaren.
I'm going to rest up today and by tomorrow I should be able to use my magic again. By Monday I should have all the answers I need. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine,
she said, placing a hand on Jaren's shoulder, then walked out.